The Torah reading of Toldos concerns itself with the birth of the great patriarch of the Jewish people, Jacob, after whom we will all be named, by his second name, given name by God, Israel, and his brother Esau, his twin brother. So it begins by telling us that when Isaac first marries Rebekah, she is barren. She can't have children. So she prays to God for children. In verse 22 it says, and Isaac prayed to God opposite his wife because she was barren. God accepted his prayer and his wife Rebekah conceived. The children struggled inside her, and she therefore said, if the pain of pregnancy is so great, why did I ever want children in the first place? So the children are fighting inside her. And she doesn't know why she's experiencing this kind of pain. So she goes to ask God, what's happening here in this very famous story that Rebekah, who wants to be a mother so badly, has regrets because of the pain she's experiencing. One of the most interesting explanations that I have seen is that Rebekah, of course, did not know that she was having twins. As far as she's concerned, she's pregnant with a child. Now, every time, as the Talmud says, she goes near a house of idolatry, the baby kicks. The baby gets all excited. The baby gets all enthusiastic. Later, when she comes to a monotheistic household, like that of her father-in-law, Abraham, the baby kicks again. And she gets very concerned about the fact that this child has no identity. This child accommodates whatever environment he is placed in. When he's around Jews, he puts on the yarmulke, he appeals to the Jews. When he's around Christians, he's praising Jesus. When he's around Muslims, he's talking Allah. When he's around Mormons, he's speaking about the teachings of Joseph Smith. He's almost like a politician. As we say in Yiddish, tanzt auf alle chasanas. He literally means he dances at every wedding. He can be whatever you want him to be. This is a man with no backbone, with no spine. He has no convictions. One of the reasons we so distrust politicians is that we don't believe a word that comes out of their mouth. We think they're only saying it for public consumption. When you go to a convention for gay rights, you support gay marriage. You suddenly go to speak to evangelical Christians, you're a huge opponent, and you support an amendment to the Constitution guaranteeing only opposite-sex marriages, heterosexual marriages. You're always pandering to the audience in front of you. And this is what so disappoints Rebekah. She thinks she's having this kind of child. Here I am, someone who really believes in something, as does my husband. We're part of this tiny little group, this tiny little clan of the Abrahamites who believe in monotheism. And yet I have a son who believes in nothing. That's the nature of her disappointment. When the prophet Elijah, in one of the most famous stories of the Bible, rebukes the Jewish people on Mount Carmel, there's this famous showdown that he brings the prophets of Baal, who are all prophets to idols, to false gods, but the Jews are now idol worshippers, so the prophets of Baal are the ones who really represent the people. And he's the last remaining true prophet of God. And they have this great showdown on Mount Carmel. And it's one of the most beautiful, moving stories of the Bible. All the Jewish people gather around them, and they're about to have this prayer Olympics, where each will pray to their God to see who is the true God and who will come down with fire to consume the sacrifices that are being offered. But just before the showdown, where he will mock the prophets of Baal, Elijah will say to them, scream louder to your gods. Obviously nothing happens. There is no God named Baal. He's an idol. He's a human creation. Just before he begins to mock them and scream louder, maybe he's asleep, maybe he'll wake up. He first gives a speech to the Jewish people and he says to them, Ad mosai atem poschem al shnei seikim. How long will you Jews dance on two thresholds? If Baal is God, then you should worship Baal. And if the Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is God, you should be worshiping him. But your inability to decide who you want to worship is even worse. It's a very interesting argument. A lack of conviction is even worse than having the wrong convictions at times, because if at least someone believes in something and has principles, beliefs, things for which he will live and things for which he will die, even if they're wrong, you can at least transform them. This is a principled man. You can argue with him, you can debate him, you can convince him, and then he'll be on your side. But if someone has no convictions and no principles, there's no hope for them. They stand for nothing. They believe in nothing. That's what Rebecca is concerned about here. The Apostle Paul famously says that when he was proselytizing Jews to his church, he says, to the Jew I would come as a Jew in order to win over the Jews. To those under the law, I would come as one under the law, in order that I might win those who were under the law. To those who were outside of the law, I would come as one who was outside of the law, someone who had abrogated the commandments, so as to win over those outside the law. I become all things to all men, so that I might save their souls. That kind of Zelig-like existence, that kind of chameleon-like behavior is what is rejected here. Rebecca says, look, if I have a son who's an idolater, at least I can talk to him and perhaps persuade him otherwise. But if I have a son who really has no belief system and he is nothing but a panderer and he just always submits to peer pressure, that is the nature of her disappointment. This is something that I always discuss with my kids, because the greatest force influencing teenagers especially, children in general and teenagers in particular, is peer pressure. Everybody wants to fit in. Everybody wants to be accepted. Nobody wants to be left outside the camp. No one wants to be lonely outside the tent. So, especially in teenage years, you see young people beginning to slowly compromise their identity, their convictions, their beliefs to fit in. And what the voice of the parent is supposed to be is the voice of principle. We're supposed to give our children the strength, the inner identity, and the wherewithal to swim against the tide of peer pressure and acculturation, so that they can be themselves, so that they never feel they have to accommodate somebody else in order to be loved. And occasionally, when you find, say, a politician who has core convictions, even if you don't agree with those convictions, he elicits the public's respect because it is so uncommon to have someone like that. You know, I wrote a book called 10 Conversations You Need to Have with Your Children, and this is, the book is based on actual conversations I've had with my kids for years, and this was one of the principal conversations. Never be what others want you to be. Be who you are. Have core beliefs that you do not compromise. When I was the rabbi at Oxford, I witnessed what so many other Hillel directors, Chabad directors, rabbis on campus would witness, which is that a very large number, unfortunately, of students who arrive from Orthodox Jewish households slowly see their observance wane considerably and rapidly, because for the first time, when they are outside the observant environment of their home, Jewish high school, Jewish day school, and now they're in the big world, they want to fit in and their observance subsides. And one of my goals at Oxford was not only to get many non-observant students to experience the beauties of Jewish tradition so that they might embrace it, it was also to ensure that those who came with it would hold on to it. The point is, we're not supposed to be creatures of our environment. We're supposed to have an inner identity. In America today, the country is so deeply polarized between conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, that if you even go to a dinner party and someone, let's say, is praising President Obama, even if you feel differently, you sometimes bite your tongue to even politely disagree because you don't want to be seen as the odd person out at the dinner party, or conversely. Someone is criticizing him, but you really like him and you don't want to alienate your friends or this social circle. It happens all the time. And as we lose our principles and convictions and we just say what other people want to hear, we actually become boring people. Because each and every one of us has a gift, a very unique gift, to contribute to the lives of others. But when you erase that gift in order to be accepted, you become very bland. You become the color of water. Water assumes the color of whatever glass you place it into. So that is Rebekah's concern. And so what God says to her, don't worry, there's actually 2 children. And each and every one of them actually is very principled. Esau for the wrong reasons, Jacob for the right reasons. But you have nothing to worry about. This isn't one person who changes his mind constantly. It's actually 2 different nations. And they will represent 2 very different things. Let's go to the famous story of Jacob and Esau, and Jacob's seeming deception of his father in order to obtain his brother's birthright. This is one of the most famous stories of the Bible. It has had very negative consequences for Jews throughout the ages. In this story, Jacob becomes, according to those who don't like the Jewish people, the paragon of the conniving Jew. The Jew you can't trust. The Jew who is prepared to breach any ethics, to compromise any morals in order to get ahead. Hi.
Hi.
My gosh, you braved the weather to actually come here. So I was saying, we just did some of the Parsha, now we're continuing. This is a transcription thing, so I'm sorry.
That's fine.
I have this weird thing coming out of my ear.
Go ahead.
The story of Jacob seemingly stealing his brother's birthright blessing is one of the great stories of the Bible. And I was just commenting that it actually serves as a source for a lot of anti-Semitism throughout the ages. Because the argument that anti-Semites and non-Jews make is that the Jews are hucksters and tricksters. They will do anything for a profit. They will do anything to get ahead. This harks back to the actions of Jacob. His poor gullible brother Esau is taken advantage of by Jacob's guile in deceiving his own blind father into blessing him when really he was the second-born son. Yes, they're twins, but Esau's older. The story begins, we have different promotion here. Begins in chapter 27, verse 1. To give you an idea of how poorly Jacob's character fares in this story, no less an authority than Rabbi Harold Kushner, who is a dear friend and wrote a book called Living a Life That Matters, severely criticizes Jacob in this story. And he says, if you look at Abraham, Abraham represents truth, as does Isaac. Jacob, however, is someone who is not very moral. He's prepared to deceive. He's always trying to manipulate situations for personal gain. And Rabbi Kushner goes on to say that Jacob will later mature and he will get better because he's deceived even by his own sons about the death of Joseph. He will experience that what goes around comes around, karma. But this story would seem to indicate that Jacob is immoral.
Lavan.
I'm sorry?
Lavan takes advantage.
The Lavan.
Takes advantage of Yaakov, right?
Right. Well, Lavan does, and then his own sons do. Yes, he seems deceived in other circumstances. Is that how we are to understand the story? Did Jacob do something monumentally wrong? Because if he did, he doesn't deserve this blessing. Why would Isaac tell Esau, who comes back crying and mourning that his blessing has been stolen, that Jacob, to whom I gave the blessing, that's irreversible. I mean, clearly, if someone's not worthy of a blessing, they're not worthy of a blessing. What is it that is transpiring here that Isaac endorses the blessing later? Later, when Esau swears he's going to kill his son, his brother, as soon as his father dies, and Rebekah hears about it and tells Jacob, you must flee because your brother wants to kill you. Isaac comes to him and says, indeed you must flee. You should not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. You must go to your mother's family and choose a wife. And then he blesses him again. Now clearly, if he thinks his son is a trickster and a conniver, is reward him for his trickery. He will feel duped. He will be angry at his son. So clearly, even from the basic interpretation of this story, it is impossible to believe that what Jacob did was ultimately sinister. Because if it were, his father would never forgive him. And the blessing would never take hold. So what is happening here? And the essence of how I see this incredible story is, there is only one person who is really deceived. And that person is Isaac, who cannot see the truth of his son Esau. He loves Esau kitzayid b'fiv, because Esau has a way with words. Esau is a master of spin. He's a modern day PR guru. He can take any character defect and he can spin it into a virtue. He is the guy that the political candidates pay millions of dollars in order to get out of any kind of scandal. If the press says that you did such and such to a woman, he's the PR spinner who will say, they're saying this because they hate your politics, this is an attack by the right-wing media, by the liberal media. He can spin almost anything. But Isaac, due to parental love, cannot see the flaws in his own son. This is something that happens so frequently with us parents. We struggle to be objective about our children. A teacher will tell us, your son is really misbehaving in class, and we'll go for a parent-teacher meeting. And we'll end up having an argument with the teacher in the belief that the teacher's picking on my child. I don't see those behavior patterns. It's very difficult to see it as a parent. It's very difficult to be objective about your own flesh and blood, because truth be told, their defects are your defects. If your children are raised with many character flaws, they either learned them from you or you never raised them on a righteous path that would remedy those defects. So in truth, the flaws inherent in Esau, Isaac is largely to blame. And he can't really come to terms with who Esau is. Therefore, Rebekah's idea to find, and you can imagine that the parents have thought about this a great deal. You can imagine that Rebekah and Isaac have had many marital squabbles, where Rebekah says to him, you could see it happening in any modern household, Isaac, you're too lenient on Esau. You know, he's violent. He's a bully. He bullies his brother. He's disrespectful of other people's property. He's not honest. He's a thief. And Isaac says, no, you know, you're being too harsh on him. He actually is a very loving son. He's a very good son. And the truth is that they have a very warm relationship. Esau does love his father. That is never questioned. But as the mother is trying to say, you need to have a much stronger hand with him, Isaac cannot accept it. And this becomes a source of tension between them. You could see it's a source of tension between them, because later, when Esau marries two Hittite women who become Batihim Moras Nefesh, they cause spiritual pain to both Rebekah and to Isaac. Later, Rebekah has to say to her husband, if Jacob marries someone like my other daughters-in-law, Esau's wife, Katzli B'chai, this has made me hate my own life. And if Jacob marries one of them, Lomi Lichaim, I don't even want to live. I want to die. I can't take them anymore. Now, isn't that an interesting way of phrasing it? What she really should have said to her husband is, I want you to go and speak to Esau about his wives. They're terrible. But she's given up on getting Isaac to rebuke Esau. She's now placed all her hope on Jacob. She doesn't feel that she has the capacity to influence Isaac to take a strong hand with Esau. So this entire story now is Rebekah's attempt to get Isaac to see the truth. How does she get him to see the truth? By showing him how easily deceived he is. It's not Jacob who has this idea to fool his father. It's Rebekah. This is all Rebekah's plan. This is all Rebekah's idea. Rebekah is the one who's saying to Isaac, I cannot stand. Hi. Hi. Rebekah is the one who comes up with this plan. She pushes Jacob against his own resistance to engage in this act of deception. He says, I'm going to be made a mockery before my own father once he catches me. And he's not going to bless me, he's going to curse me. And Rebekah's response is, Olai kila lascha b'ni, let your curse be upon me. Rebekah engineers this entire thing. She goes and gets Esau's clothing, which she is holding. Rashi points out very astutely, notice that although Esau is married, he keeps his valuable clothing with his mother. He doesn't trust his own wives, because they're not honest. She's the one that prepares the food for Isaac. She's the one that puts the goat skins on top of her son's hands so that he appears very hairy, like her other son Esau. This is all Rebekah's plan. And Rebekah's intention is to show her husband, we have argued so much about Esau. I have told you 1,000 times that he's on a very bad path. Look at the women that he has married. Look at his character. This is your last chance to really bring him back. But you continue to be fooled because he knows how to manipulate you and you can't wake up to it. So this is her final gambit. When it comes to who is going to be blessed, she persuades her son to participate in an activity that will point out to Esau, this is how easy it is to fool you. When it comes to your kids, you're blind. I was speaking the other day to a world-renowned ADHD expert. The whole ADD, ADHD diagnosis is one which is very controversial. Of late, the experts are saying that you can actually see through CAT scans that there's different brain development among children who are normal versus those who are diagnosed ADD, ADHD. And that may indeed be the case. But having counseled a lot of families where a child is diagnosed with ADD, ADHD, I have usually seen that they have a parent who's ADD, ADHD, and that's not because the parent is genetically, that's not because this is a genetic inheritance, but because if you're the kind of parent who is out to lunch and is never really focused on your children, and you're always distracted and the child never feels that you're really focused on them, you're not really disciplining them, then it's hard for that child to learn how to focus as well. In other words, even if the diagnosis is correct, it could well be that this is supposed to be treated behaviorally more than pharmacologically. I don't want to enter into this debate because I don't claim any expertise in this, but my point is that parents have these conversations all the time. We have a child who's out of control. Whose fault is it? Oh, you're being too tough on him. Kids behave that way. No, kids don't behave that way. He's screaming, he's yelling. Well, you're being too tough on him. Then you begin to disagree about the remedy. In order for Rebekah to finally resolve this dispute that has probably been going on for decades, she must resort to an act of deception which will wake Isaac up to how gullible he really is. Because as soon as he awakens to it, it says, "Vayecharad Yitzchak charod gedola." Esau comes back with his own food. He says to his father, I'm here, and I brought you the food that you wanted, please bless me. And his father says to him, who are you? I just blessed my son Esau. No, I'm your son Esau. See, that's impossible. I just blessed Esau. Who was that person that just came? Now, normally we would interpret the verse to mean that Isaac began to tremble and quake because he felt that he had blessed the wrong person. That's what scared him. But the real interpretation is he began to tremble and quake because he suddenly began to realize the mistake he had been making all his life. Because if you say that the interpretation is that Isaac is shaking and trembling over giving the wrong child the blessing, why is that so significant? Give your son another blessing. My God, since when does a parent only give a child one blessing? And if it's the most important blessing, the firstborn blessing, then give him something that's very close. But the idea that life is over, that the universe has ceased to exist, that some terrible error has been made, doesn't make sense. But if it suddenly dawns on Isaac that he has employed the wrong parenting methods with Esau throughout his life, and his wife was correct all along, and he is now responsible for what his son has become, imagine how he would feel. It would be terrifying. And it is a terrifying experience. When you're a parent, and you've tried to do what's right, and tried to give your children a moral and ethical education, but you've made mistakes along the way. You've showed temper, you've yelled and screamed at home. And you've thought to yourself, it's not a big deal because this is my flaw, but I'm raising my children to be calm. And then one day you see your own child fly off the handle with this incredible temper tantrum. And you begin to shiver and quake, not at their behavior, but at the knowledge that you are responsible for this. That everything that you did over the years thinking would have no impact has actually ruined your child. Or lesser things, you've used vulgar language, and now they'll never use it around you, but you suddenly hear them using it on the phone with a friend, or you accidentally come across some of their emails, or you've even told them you're going to be checking their emails, and you now see that their language is just vulgar. Or they bully because you've bullied. Or they're disrespectful of women because you've been disrespectful of your own wife. That would make you shake to your core. Because there's nothing that we care more about in this world than our children. And there's nothing of which we will be less forgiving to ourselves than feeling responsible for their mistakes. That is this is why Isaac begins to tremble. Seen in this light, Jacob's not a conniver or a trickster. This was never his idea. I'm amazed that so many people fault him. I'm amazed that in this story, and this is a very important story, you have to understand, as I said before some of you came in, this story is the beginning of anti-Semitism. Abraham is entirely likable. He has some flaws, he's not perfect. The whole story of telling his wife, tell Pharaoh we're brother, sister, is problematic. His willingness to put his own son to death at God's command is certainly morally problematic. But you can never say that he's a selfish person. If Pharaoh is going to kill him because he has a beautiful wife, that's not selfish action. He doesn't want his own wife to be widowed. And his preparedness to put his own son to death is certainly not a selfish action. You could say it's the action of an extremist. Why is he prepared to do this? It elicits many moral questions. But you can never accuse him of real egocentrism. His whole life is trying to live according to God's will. Isaac is the same. Isaac is prepared to be put to death. He knows exactly towards the end of the binding of Isaac's story, the Akedah of what's going to happen to him. He knows, he says to his father, where's the sacrifice? And his father says, let's see, God will show it. All right. He knows exactly what, and he's prepared to die. The source of anti-Semitism is in this story where Jacob, after whom we are all named, Israel, comes across as someone who will do anything to profit. And yet the story never portrays him as a trickster. The story portrays him as reluctantly fooling his father based on his mother giving him no other choice. It is Isaac who's responsible. And the lesson to all of us is that Judaism holds parents accountable for their children's errors. That's the real meaning of the blessing that we say when a child is bar mitzvah. Baruch shepaturani me'onish halazeh. What does that mean? The traditional understanding of this blessing, blessed be he who now absolves me of the guilt of this little one. The traditional interpretation is that up until the age of 13, everything a child does in terms of sin gets put onto his father's account. It's his father's sins. And at 13 he becomes morally culpable. So the father says, blessed be God who now has absolved me from my own son's sin or iniquity. Understood in that way, the blessing is ridiculous. A 5-year-old has no sin. A 10-year-old has no sin. They're not doing anything wrong. They're too young to be culpable. The real meaning of the verse is that up until the age of 13, all of my children's flaws and faults were my fault. If he doesn't go to sleep on time, that's because I never really insisted on a proper bedtime. If he didn't do his homework, it's because I was watching TV and I didn't sit with him and do it. If he became a bully at school, it's because I never punished him sufficiently to ensure he understands the consequences of his own actions. All of his sins are my fault, not on my account. They are due to my negligence. There are 2 sins that a parent makes: a sin of omission and a sin of commission. And the former is far greater than the latter. The bad things we do, sins of commission, will mean that our children will learn from our poor example. But those can be purged from character. The child can change. What if you're guilty of a sin of omission? What if you didn't show the child enough love, and he or she grows up to be immensely insecure? What if they're a girl who by the age of 15 or 16 is sleeping with boys at school just to feel love, masculine presence, and she cannot say no because she doesn't have the strength to say no. She is so desperate for love because you, her father, never gave her the masculine validation she needed so that she's not desperate for male attention. She already has it. How do you make up for sins of omission? You can't really. They're much worse. I often say to my kids, because I'm often guilty of sins of commission, but I don't want to be guilty of the sins of omission. I often say to my kids, because as I said before, this book I wrote, 10 Conversations You Need to Have with Your Children, I'm a great believer in having regular and ongoing conversations with kids. And I've had thousands of them with my children. And I've often said to them, I said, every child has complaints about his or her parents. It goes with the territory. In fact, it provides ample conversation material for dates and for marriage. Your mother's like this, your father's like this. Or you try to analyze yourself based on how your parents raised you and you share that with your spouse. It's a very vital and necessary conversation topic. I said, no doubt when you get older, when either you guys are lying on a psychiatrist's couch, hopefully not, or in conversation with your spouse, you'll be able to say, you know, my father made this mistake and that mistake, and then he did this and that, and it'll all be true. The errors and the flaws that you point out in me will all be true. But the one thing you will not be able to say is that I never knew if I was loved, because I always put you first. That you'll never be able to say. You'll never have to question if you were worthy of love. You will never feel that you had to earn it. That's the main gift that we parents give our children, the gift of unconditional love and acceptance. But if we give them unconditional love and acceptance, that doesn't come with both hands of love, because there's 2 hands of love. There's the right hand of love and the left hand of love. The right hand of love, the Kabbalah says, represents love in its most overt form, buying presents, displays of affection. But the left hand of love is, you better not cross the street or I'll slap your hand if you do that again, because I'm going to save you from harming yourself. The left hand of love is, go into the corner because of the way you just spoke to your mother. That's just as loving as the overt display of love. And if you give your child only one and not the other, you cripple them. In the same way that someone who only has a right leg and not a left leg is going to hop. A child who is only given criticism is going to be crippled. And a child who is only given affirmation, but is never given any kind of constructive criticism, is going to be crippled. That is the story of Isaac and Esau. And that is what Rebekah sought to correct. There is another point, however. There is another point, however. Sorry, just a second. Any questions for a moment while I go on to another explanation? That convincing, huh?
No, I'm not. I mean, it seems like Pshat's pretty straightforward. It seems like in other places in the Torah where it wants to give a pedagogical lesson, it tells you what the pedagogical lesson is. When God, wants to teach Yonah a lesson, grows a kid Kayon, it says here's a pedagogical lesson. This one just seems just ever so slight hints that there's a pedagogical lesson.
Which is?
That the pedagogical lesson that Rivka is trying to teach Yitzhak here, the one that you're positing. I'm not quite.
Well, I'm not saying that Rivka is trying to impart any lesson specifically to Yitzchak. I'm saying that damage has been done to this family by Yitzchak's blindness toward Esau. In fact, he starts by saying, "I'm blind." It's almost like a Freudian slip. I can't see, and he says it to Esau. I can't see who you really are. And then he says to him, "Go and get me all the things that I like," which is almost a relationship of manipulation. You get me things that I like, and I do things that you like, and that's not the way the parent-child relationship is supposed to be. I mean, what was Yitzchak even asking? Get me something to eat so that I would bless you? What does that even mean? Do we ever say that to our kids? Go and do something for me, and then I'll bless you.
Strange.
The power of Judaism what makes Judaism so unique is that we have no Jesus figures. There isn't one perfect person. Our name is Israel, he who struggles with God. And that means we also struggle with our godly nature and with our more animal nature. In the same way that in 2 weeks' time, Jacob will wrestle with an angel, we wrestle with our demons every day. And that applies to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as well. It's quite remarkable that a religion is prepared to point out the flaws, including the parenting flaws, of its greatest leaders. If Isaac is an imperfect parent, and he is, because Esau would not have been who he is, and Abraham's an imperfect parent. He's criticized in the Talmud for leniency toward Yishmael. It's only Jacob whom we say mitasa shlema, that all of his children, flawed as they might be, remained within the Jewish fold. Why do we respect them then? Why do we respect imperfect people? It's far better for us to have Jesus figures, Buddha figures. In Islam, Muhammad is not divine, of course, but just try to criticize him. Why do we respect these people if they're not perfect? Because righteousness in Judaism is not defined by perfection, it's defined by struggle. It's the man or woman who wrestles to do better amid an imperfect nature that is to be praised. The Zohar expresses it very beautifully. It says, "Kariskafia sitra achra yistalek yekara dekutchabricha b'chalamin." Every time we fight with the other side, the sitra achra, the dark side, every time we engage it, even if we fall sometimes, but the fact that we're prepared to fight for what's important, the glory of God goes higher and higher. It's he or she who wrestles to do the right thing that is truly righteous. And that's why these stories are so relevant. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that Rebecca is engaging in this activity in order to teach her husband a lesson. I'm saying she's undoing the incredible damage that has been done in the family, with Esau now running the show. And she's finally decided to put a stop to it. And the way she's going to put a stop to it is to finally get her husband to wake up to who he is. On the contrary, I would say that the literal understanding that most people have, that this is connivance on the part of Jacob, does not fit into the story at all. If he's such a trickster, why didn't he come up with the story, with the idea? Why is it Rebecca? And if he's such a trickster, why does he resist it? And if he's such a trickster, how is it that everybody ends up fooling him? He should be manipulating them. He's manipulated by Lavan. He's manipulated by his own children. If anything, he's the gullible one. He's a bit like his father. Like father, like son. Isaac is gullible, and so is Jacob. Because there's an innocent quality to them. And if he's gullible, and if he is a trickster, why does the Torah say that he's an Ish Tam Yoshev Olim? The exact opposite of a manipulative person. He was a simple person, stated in a virtuous light. What you see was what you got. Toho Kebaro. His outside and inside, external, internal, it was the same. So the whole story suddenly doesn't fit. And like I said before, one of the commitments I made to myself in this class is that it would not go on forever. So I'm conscious at the time. But if you actually look in all the verses, this interpretation I'm offering, I think fits the verses in their simplest form the best. So for example, it explains why Jacob has to be put reluctantly into the story. It explains why it is driven entirely by Rebecca. It explains why Isaac is so easily fooled. How is he so easily fooled? That's another big question in this story. Does Isaac really not know who this is? This is just incredible. He even says, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. Now, when someone calls you on the phone, how long does it take you until you know exactly who's calling you? A second? And there's no physical form, and you're not touching their hands, so from the voice alone, he should have known who this is, right?
How old was he that time when he gave bracha?
Right. He was blind, but he wasn't deaf. How could it be that Esau did not know who this was? Unless he is a victim of cognitive dissonance. What's cognitive dissonance? It's a very famous psychological term. Cognitive dissonance is where there is a truth that is so painful and so dangerous that you just cannot accept it. The mind tunes it out, notwithstanding how obvious it is. Albert Einstein could not accept quantum mechanics. He was dismissed by many as a bumbling fool for the last decades of his life because he dismissed what was absolutely obvious, that God does, that dice is being played with the universe, that quantum mechanics is all about uncertainty, that you can't make perfect measurements, and he couldn't accept this. So the last part of his life, he makes no significant scientific contributions. Now, why couldn't Einstein accept this? Because it was absurd to him. How could the universe be so unpredictable? How could mathematics not be perfect? Here, Isaac cannot accept who Esau really has become. So when he sees that Esau is sort of Jacob-like, he's virtuous, he mentions God, etc., he really wants to believe this is Esau, even though it sounds just like Jacob. He has to believe that his son is virtuous. He cannot accept what has really happened to him. And dare I say, I think this story is very relevant to all of us because we see it with our own children all the time. We can't often accept what has really occurred because the consequences for our own happiness, for our own acceptance of ourselves is just too great. But Mark, the main thing is, why does Yitzchak say, "Vayecharad Yitzchak Charad Gedola"? His whole life suddenly began to quake and shake. How significant is this blessing that it's the end of the world if it was mixed up?
Well, I take the blessing of the firstborn seriously in those days.
Okay. So he would have gotten monumentally upset at the person who deceived him. Why does it say that he got so upset? He was fooled. It should have said that he lost his temper at Jacob. He became furious, but he's furious at himself, which is fascinating. Meaning, he now knows that he's been deceived. He blames himself. He's deceived himself. And that's why he immediately says, he'll be blessed. I gave the blessing to the right person. If you're correct, that he's very upset that he gave the blessing to the wrong person, he should have said, I will now curse him. He doesn't say that. He's blessed. So the regular understanding is, he says that he's blessed because he can't take back the blessing. Why would we think that?
The blessing of firstborn.
Okay, I get it. So give him a blessing, give him a curse as well. You can do both. But he doesn't say that. He will remain blessed.
Give a second.
He now knows that Jacob was the righteous one all along. And it's fascinating that he would say that after an act of deception. There is another thing I want to add. That's my understanding of this Torah reading. But there is something else I want to add. Let's go back to the simple interpretation of the story. That Jacob basically sees that Esau's a really bad guy. And he's prepared to engage in an act of deception against his own father in order to stop him from getting monumental power, becoming like a superhero with this incredible blessing that he's going to get from his very righteous, saintly father. I mentioned before that Rabbi Harold Kushner says, wait a second, this is feeding into all the anti-Semitic stereotypes. He doesn't say that exactly, but this is feeding into all the anti-Semitic stereotypes that Jews are not to be trusted. And Kushner sort of accepts that. And I mentioned Kushner's a very special man, by the way. He's a great man. And he's also one of the most famous rabbis in America and one of the most influential. So when he says this, it should be taken seriously. So I wrote an entire essay disputing what he said. And I sent it to him, and we discussed it on the phone. And here's what I said. Even if I take the story at face value, and again, I don't think it fits the verses, but even if I take it at face value, that Jacob is deceptive, and Jacob fools his father, and Jacob will do anything to get the blessing. And earlier, Jacob won't even give his brother a bowl of soup unless he gives him his firstborn blessing. I still believe that Jacob did the right thing, and that Kushner is absolutely wrong in condemning him or criticizing him for his activities, for his actions. I'll tell you why. From time immemorial, there has been a dispute among philosophers as to whether people should dirty their hands with the ugliness of this world. The world is filled with corruption. It operates mostly on money. It is driven by things like sexuality. There are bad people who hurt good people. The world is corrupt. And there have been two philosophical responses to that corruption. One is, distance yourself from it. Create your own righteous enclave. Live in a monastery. Live in a yeshiva. Never go out into the world. Create your own. Let the world go to hell. It's not your problem. You will never be able to redeem the world. It's irredeemable. What you can do is create your own private righteous universe. That has been one approach. Then there's the Jewish approach. He who wrestles with God. We are going to fight against the world's corruption. When the world chooses death, we're going to choose life. When the Arab citizens, our brothers, create a region in the world ruled by tyranny, the oppression of women, the oppression of gays, bereft of democracy, bereft of human rights, we are going to create a state in that region, in our land, not in Western Europe, not in North America, where it would be nice and easy, in our land. And when they try to kill us, we're going to protect ourselves, even if it means at times having to do things that are morally uncomfortable. That's the second philosophy, and it's the Jewish philosophy. That he who says, I will not involve myself in the world's corruption, I will let it go to hell because I am concerned about the state of my own soul, that person is guilty of moral cowardice. Albert Einstein, you know, as we debate, there's a Republican debate on right now, and as we debate how smart Rick Perry is and his flubs, and Herman Cain's recent flubs on Libya, I've always said intelligence has never been a vital part of leadership. Ronald Reagan, who is acknowledged by both right and left to at least have been a very effective president, was dismissed during his presidency as a moron, as a buffoon, as an imbecile, constantly. Abraham Lincoln, by far our greatest president, according to everyone, virtually, except select holdovers of the Confederacy, still living in the South, was dismissed in his lifetime as a knuckle-dragging backwoodsman who told embarrassing stories, spoke in a high-pitched squealing voice that humiliated him in his public encounters. He was never a great speaker. He wrote beautiful speeches. His written speeches are the greatest speeches we have in American history. Jimmy Carter supposedly has the highest IQ of any recent president, and I would venture to say he was our least effective president, or if he was effective, it was negatively effective. Albert Einstein was the smartest man of the past 1,000 years, probably, and yet he argued that the Western powers should be pacifists. They should disarm in the face of Hitler's aggression initially. Can you imagine if he had been the president of the United States? He was, after all, later you have to be born in the United States, but he did become an American president, American citizen. Can you imagine if we had listened to the smartest man in the world and had no guns to fight Hitler? We'd all be dead. Pacifism is an immoral ideology. Let them fight. As long as let them kill each other, I'm not going to get involved. In Rwanda, I won't get involved. In the Holocaust, I won't get involved. In the slaughter of the Armenians in the First World War by the Ottoman Turks, I won't get involved. In the slaughter, Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot's slaughter of the Cambodians, I won't get involved. That is moral cowardice. There's no such thing as an innocent bystander. The innocent bystander in the face of grotesque evil is morally culpable. So even if it's true that we read this in the most literal sense, Jacob did the right thing. He was not going to let Esau inherit the world. If he had to bomb German cities to stop Hitler, he was going to do that. And some civilians, unfortunately, tragically, were going to die. If he was going to pulverize certain cities like Hamburg and Dresden in order to stop Hitler once and for all, he was going to do that too. He was going to do things that were very morally questionable. You have to sometimes when you are fighting monumental evil. You have no choice. And to say, my name is Harry Truman, and I don't want anyone ever questioning my presidency, so I'm not even going to engage in the question of whether we drop an atomic bomb, and I'm going to send 1 million American soldiers to their deaths as they try to invade the Japanese homeland, the Japanese islands. That's moral cowardice. You were elected to take difficult decisions like this and have historians forever debate whether you were a moral man or not. If your name is Winston Churchill and you're bombing German cities, your response is not to say, I can't do this. I don't want anyone accusing me of anything. Your job is to defend freedom and civilization. And sometimes you're going to have to do things that will be condemned widely till today. If your name is George Bush, you may have to take out Saddam Hussein and have people say you did it for oil. If your name is Barack Obama, you may have to use predator strikes, killing terrorists, and have people say, I thought Obama wasn't Bush, I thought he was different. Now, look how murderous he is. Al-Awlaki didn't even have a trial, and he was an American citizen when they blew him up. But if you refuse to engage evil, you are yourself evil. So Jacob was not going to allow Esau to take over the world. And I'm surprised that great men like Rabbi Kushner would rather see Esau become the dominant power just so long as Jacob doesn't fight him too much. We have to outsmart our enemies. We have to, and we sometimes will do things. That's why so many Jews today are opposed to the state of Israel. When Israel was only a positive story, taking in unwanted Jews from Arab lands right after the 1947 war, defeating Nasser and other Arab tyrannies in the Six-Day War, all Jews loved Israel. Everybody loved Israel. Europeans loved Israel. But the moment the Intifada started, and Jews were being blown up, and Israel used very strong tactics to stop it, building walls, targeted assassinations of terrorist leaders, the invasion of Lebanon, the invasion of Gaza. Some people said, you know what, this is not what I signed up for. I support Israel because it's not controversial. I support Israel because it doesn't ever do the things that Esau might do. What do you mean Israel blows people up even and blows up terrorists? But sometimes there's collateral damage. I can't sign up for that. Well, if you don't sign up for that, then the whole world will ultimately be ruled by terrorists. We have a moral obligation. So all those people who are critical of Jacob, even if you take this at its most straightforward interpretation, pacifism is not an innocent philosophy. It lets the world go to hell. We reject the Christian belief that the world is less important than the heavens. That you use this world in order to gain salvation or entry into the heavens. We believe in this world and making it more righteous. And sometimes we get our hands dirty doing so. Your sex drive, you can either decide, I'm going to be celibate, and I'm going to flagellate the body whenever I have erotic stirrings, or you can try your best to live a morally righteous life where your sexuality is directed towards the person that you love and you're married to, and you may fall here and there, and you may end up looking at porn here and there, and you may end up feeling, even if you don't commit adultery, you may feel attracted to someone, you may hurt your spouse. But not to get married? To say, I don't want to engage in all that. I would rather just say, this is uncontrollable, this is a force beyond me, I'm just going to shut it down. That's not the Jewish way. Money. I don't want to make money because I'm going to become greedy, I'm going to become materialistic, I'm just going to learn in yeshiva the whole day, I'm just going to focus on my own development. Who's going to support righteous causes? And the truth is that a lot of these people who are very charitable, they are arrogant. A lot of the people are materialistic. But look at all the good they do. We Jews are not afraid to enter into a morally complex world to try to do the right thing. That is the example set by Jacob. And in that sense, maybe that's why he's chosen to be the leader of the Jewish people. For all the good that Abraham did, Abraham cut himself off from the world. He took the let the world go to hell approach. Avram HaIvri, he was Abraham who was cut off from the rest of the world. And you'll notice, Abraham made, people shaking their heads, let me just tell you the truth, according to what the Torah says. Abraham made almost no impact on the world. I'll prove it. Because if Isaac had died, monotheism would have died with him. Abraham had very few converts. Abraham stays away from Sodom and Gomorrah. He refuses to engage them. He'll pray for them from a distance, but he will not live in their midst. And maybe that was proper for Abraham's time, because the kernel of truth which he had sown was so vulnerable that it couldn't be exposed. It wasn't strong enough to be exposed to a real challenge. And the same thing was true with Isaac. The Talmud says Isaac is an Olo Tamima. He's a holy sacrifice. He's not even allowed to go down into Egypt. He also cuts himself off from the world. Abraham and Isaac are very insular. They represent a Jewish ideology of insularity. And it's one that we ultimately reject. And Abraham, therefore, is not the father of the Jewish people. He's the father of many nations. Isaac is not the father of the Jewish people. Jacob. We are B'nai Yisrael. We are children of Israel. Because Jacob is the first to say, God must be a part here on earth, in the good places and the bad places. And we will fight for this. In that sense, that's why Israel is so precious to me. Because Israel wrestles every day with these great moral questions. And it makes mistakes. But ultimately, it's dedicated toward a righteous existence and not letting the bad guys run the world. And by the way, you will find, just to finally prove my point and to end, you will find that this is true of any person who's considered great in history. Any person who's considered to be a great figure in history was usually morally tainted by a great conflict, and they did not shirk from that moral confusion and chaos. They did their best to stand up for the right when it was very difficult to do so. Again, go back to Abraham Lincoln. How many Americans died in the Civil War? Anyone know? About 600,000. Do you understand how many that is? We make a big deal about Vietnam, and we should. 57,000 died in Vietnam. That's how many died in the 3 days of Gettysburg. Why did Lincoln continue with the war? Let the South be independent. States' rights. People should decide under what government they want to live. Who was Lincoln to tell people in South Carolina they should be part of the Union? Who was Lincoln to tell people in the Deep South and Mississippi that they had to remain Americans in that sense of the word? And the truth is, he was called a butcher in his time. Ulysses S. Grant was truly called a butcher. The way Grant won the war was to just fight to the point where he no longer cared about casualties. McClellan, who is the hapless general that is forgotten by history or remembered as an incompetent general, he cared about his soldiers' lives. He would not let them die in such big number. But Grant is brought from the West to take over the Army of the Potomac, and his strategy is, whoever dies, dies. We're going to end this damn thing once and for all. And the numbers were staggering. Why is Grant remembered as one of the greatest generals we've ever had? And Lincoln as our greatest president? Because they were prepared to do morally questionable things to stand up for great ideals and principles. For Lincoln, it was the evil of slavery. Yes, it was keeping the Union together first and foremost. It's a unity of the country and the evil of slavery. And he was prepared to be called a slaughterer and a butcher and a killer, and he stayed the course. Churchill was the same. Nobody wanted war in Britain or Europe in the 1930s. They had just seen the flower of European youth decimated in the First World War. This past summer, I took Debbie and 3 of our kids to the World War I battlefields in Flanders, in Belgium, and in France, the poppy fields. I can't describe. I wrote some essays about it. I think some of them were printed in the Jewish Standard. It's indescribable. Endless rows of graves. Who wanted to see that again? And Churchill, who stood up to Hitler, was seen as a warmonger. He was dismissed as a crank. He was dismissed as a belligerent. He was a hostile. He was a drunk, they said. But he saved civilization by being prepared to be hated by those people who called him immoral, just like Jacob is here in fighting Esau. That is what distinguishes the Jewish people. A preparedness to fight evil. And that is the reason why, by the way, we are the only religion in the world that endorses the hatred of evil, that even obligates it. There is no religion on earth that says what King Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. There is a time to love and a time to hate. Where does Christianity ever say there's a time to hate? On the contrary, Jesus says you have to love your enemies. Jesus says that you have to turn the other cheek, which has been the argument pacifists have used, that it finds its foundation in the New Testament. Now, Jesus was right. You should love your enemies if your enemy is the guy who steals your parking space. But you should not love God's enemies. To say we should love the SS is morally absurd. Or that we should love Hamas or Hezbollah. Likewise, to turn the other cheek, if someone kills one of your children, you're supposed to let them kill the other? That's absurd. We have an obligation to hate evil. King David actually says, I have hated them with a complete loathing, those who fight against God. I'll conclude with a little story that I think sums this up. About 15 years ago, Debbie and I were invited to Cape Town, South Africa with the WPO, the World Presidents Organization, and I spoke about one of my books. One of the highlights of the trip was that they took us to Robbins Island, where Nelson Mandela was incarcerated for 17 years of his 27 years. and where he almost went blind from crushing lime day and night, the stone of the island. And they had a panel with about 6 people who were in prison with Mandela, speaking to all of us, about 400 of us. And then there was a white man, and we didn't know what he was doing on the panel. And each of the former prisoners gave their story. It was very moving. It was then the turn of this white man. I remember him being bearded. I remember him, Debbie, if you remember, he had like a cast or something, I can't remember. He gets up and he's, I'm here. I was a South African policeman under apartheid. And there was an uprising in one of the townships, and I was given an order to quell it. So I walked into the city, took a black family, mother, father, and I can't remember exactly, but 6 or 7 of their kids, put them in a house. I put them in the house, I sealed the door, we lit it up, and we torched them all to death, and that ended, when people saw the severity of the reprisals, it ended the uprising. Well, I was arrested for murder. Even in apartheid South Africa, you couldn't just go and kill people. I was tried for murder, and I was given a life sentence. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came along with, under Archbishop Tutu, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the way it worked is you get up, you confess your crimes, and you're let off scot-free. He said, I confessed my crimes, I was released from jail, and I so regret what I did, and he starts to cry, and I wish I could make it better, and I've devoted my life towards black-white reconciliation. 400 people started to clap for him. Well, it was really 398, because Debbie and I didn't clap. I waited till the clapping and this Kodak moment ended, and I stood up and I said, Sir, the fact that you would be treated as a conquering hero, as this great symbol of reconciliation, is painful to watch. I said, you, sir, are a murderer, and you cannot be absolved from the murder of 10 people in cold blood, including so many children, by simply saying you're sorry. There are some things from which you can never come back, and you deserve lifelong punishment. And what a trivialization of human life that you were allowed to just get off scot-free by expressing remorse. When I sat down, one of Mandela's closest friends stood up and said, I'm not surprised you're saying that. I see you're Jewish. The Jews, Mandela's a great man, so this doesn't reflect on him. He said, the Jews don't even have the word forgiveness in the Hebrew language. They are not a forgiving people. I stood back up and I said, correction, sir, there are 3 words for forgiveness in Hebrew. Slicha, mechila, and kapara. 3. Because we mostly believe in forgiveness. We just believe that forgiveness is something so precious that it cannot be granted by words alone. And we also believe that life is of such infinite value that a strong message must be sent that those who take it must receive their just reward. But I will never laud you as a hero. You are not a hero. You killed these people because they were black. That was the only reason. Again, morally challenging story. It's much easier to clap and say wonderful and just... But if you want a world where terrorists are not just released, and I don't mean in a Gilad Shalit transfer, where at least there's a reason. I mean where they're just released because the guy who killed 73 people in Norway, he's going to get off in 14 years. Because there's no hatred of evil, there's no revulsion, and that's why we don't fight these people as hard. On the contrary, in the United States that could never happen. Timothy McVeigh could have gotten up for the next 1,000 years and said, I'm sorry, I regret it, I want to be reconciled with the federal government, the poor 150 odd people in Oklahoma were killed, I'm sorry. We still would have given him the death penalty. Because the United States is built on this Judeo-Christian value, greatly influenced by Judaism, that people who are that heinous cannot achieve absolution. They have to be fought. And that's why the United States fights terrorists, and so many of the European nations do not. And I got to tell you, for all my criticisms of President Obama, he has done an incredible job at even escalating these predator drone strikes against terrorists. And that's what we learned from Jacob. You have to fight evil. And you can be criticized till this day. And people can say, oh, I want Jacob to be saintly. I want him to sit in the yeshiva. What's he doing? Tricking his brother. He's not going to let Esau rule the world. He's just not. You can condemn him, you can hate him, you can put him down, but he's not letting Esau take over. He doesn't care what you think about it. He's going to do the right thing even if he's hated for it. Because of everything I've learned throughout history, I love history, the single greatest ingredient, the leading ingredient of human greatness is a preparedness to be hated to do the right thing. There are those who are prepared to be hated to do the right thing, and that's why the Jews are the most hated of nations, because it would have been far easier to become Christians. They would have loved us, but that's not who we are. We'll fight to hold on to what we believe in, even if we're hated or killed for it. That's what makes us unique. That's what we get from Jacob. Hence, we are called on his name, not on Abraham's name and not on Isaac's name. And I'm not trying to be critical of Abraham and Isaac. I'm simply pointing out there was an evolution in this idea. Abraham was not strong enough to fight it. He will fight to save Lot, but he's not ready to yet live. And by the way, even Jacob doesn't fully live among the nations of the world. He's also a little bit secluded. He lives with Laban for 22 years, but then he secludes himself. The first Jew to really live in the world and retain his identity is Joseph. And that's why we bless our children to be like the children of Joseph, because those are the lives that we lead today.